The blood-stained maid stumbled through the door of Murphy's diner at 3:22 in the morning, and the fluorescent lights overhead caught her like a spotlight on the worst night of her life. Nora Voss was 27 years old, but desperation had aged her by decades, carved lines into her face that belonged to someone who had stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped believing that tomorrow would be different. Her dark hair hung matted and plastered against her pale forehead. Her winter coat was torn at the left shoulder, the seams split open like a wound. The front of her blue cleaning uniform was soaked through with blood that did not belong to her, someone else's emergency, someone else's crisis, someone else's terror that had splattered across her chest as she ran through the frozen streets of Boston with nothing but the name of a child burning in her throat. She collapsed into the first booth. Her hand shook so violently she could barely grip the edge of the table. Snow from her shoes melted across the black and white checkered floor in small pools of dirty water. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and grease and that particular loneliness that only exists at 3 in the morning when the world has gone to sleep and you are still awake, still fighting, still bleeding. In the corner booth, 3 men in dark suits went absolutely still. Nicholas Castellano sat with his back to the wall, as men like him always did. He was 38 years old, with black hair and eyes that had watched too many people die to be surprised by anything anymore. His cashmere coat cost more than Nora Voss made in a year. A scar ran along his jawline like a blade, a permanent reminder of a debt paid in violence when he was young enough to still believe that violence was the answer. Sergio and Dario flanked him on either side, Sergio with his hand already moving toward the concealed weapon at his ribs, Dario with his jaw clenched and his body coiled like a spring. Nicholas raised one finger. Just one finger, and both men stopped. He watched the woman in the destroyed cleaning uniform stumble toward him. He did not know why she was walking toward him instead of the counter, instead of the waitress who was not there because it was 3:22 in the morning and nobody with a choice worked at Murphy's diner at 3:22 in the morning. Nora looked up. Her eyes were blue like broken ice, and they found his face across the diner like she knew exactly who he was, like she had been searching for him without knowing his name. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, trembling like a candle in the wind. Emma. They found Emma. The coffee cup in Nicholas Castellano's hand froze halfway to his mouth. The cup hung there in the air, suspended in time, and the dark liquid inside it did not move because he had stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped existing in any normal way that a human being could exist when the universe suddenly folded in on itself. Emma, she repeated, and her voice broke on the second syllable. They found her. She's alive. She's alive and she knows your name and she's asking for you and I didn't know where else to go, I didn't know who to tell first, I just kept running and my legs gave out and I saw the lights of this diner and you were here and I. Sit down, Nicholas said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath, like the sound of a door closing on the rest of the world. Nora Saturday. Outside, the blizzard howled against the windows with a sound like something dying, visibility reduced to nothing but white noise and the knowledge that the city was locked in winter and no one was coming to help anyone tonight. The neon sign above the diner flickered. Once. Twice. The hum of the fluorescent lights grew louder, or maybe that was just the silence in the room, the kind of silence that happens when someone speaks a name that can never be unsaid. But what Nora Voss did not know was that the girl she had just mentioned, the child whose name she had whispered with such desperation, had not been lost to this man for 4 years by accident. She had been stolen by a human trafficker named Douglas Hale, a man with a face like a piece of meat that had been left too long in the sun, with hands that had touched things that left stains on the soul. And the only reason Nicholas Castellano had not burned down half of Boston searching for her was because the people he loved had begged him to stop, begged him to accept that she was gone, that some children did not come home. Nora did not know any of this yet. What she did know was that she had $5 in her pocket. $5. That was the sum total of her wealth in the entire world. $5 to her name, and 7 days left before the foreclosure notice on her apartment became real and the lock changed and every single thing she owned was put out on the street like garbage. She knew that Douglas Hale had tried to touch her at a gas station 3 weeks ago, his hands reaching for her face with the confidence of a man who believed that desperation made women compliant. She knew that she had run instead of staying, which meant he was hunting her, which meant that everywhere she had ever been, everywhere she had ever worked, everywhere she had ever tried to build a life was now unsafe. She did not know that the woman who had been systematically destroying her reputation, who had called in her debts to landlords and spread lies about her character at the care home where she worked double shifts, Margaret Harrington, a woman so wealthy that she laundered trafficking money through charity foundations and no one had ever questioned it, had done it all on purpose. But in the diner at 3:22 in the morning, with snow accumulating against the windows and the city locked in winter silence, none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that Emma was alive. What mattered was that a child she had protected at the shelter, a girl with dark eyes and a rosebud mouth and hands so small they fit inside her palm, a girl who had stopped speaking after the first time the bad men came, that girl was alive and somewhere in this city, and someone had found her. "Tell me everything," Nicholas said. "Start at the beginning. Tell me what happened." Nora opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. The words came out in a shattered rush, like she had been holding them in for so long they had started to poison her from the inside. "I was cleaning the warehouse on Waterfront Street. The old one, the one with the broken windows. I work there twice a week, $3 an hour under the table, no questions asked. I was mopping the basement and I heard voices, so I went quiet, and I heard them talking about a little girl they had just brought in, and when they left the room I went to look, and I saw her in a cage, like an animal, and she was wearing the same pink shirt she was wearing when she came to the shelter, and I knew it was her, I knew it was Emma because I have been looking for her every single day for the past 4 years. I have been looking even when everyone told me she was dead." Sergio's hand twitched toward his weapon again. Dario's jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles flexing in his neck. Nicholas did not move. "How did you get her out?" His voice was still that deep, solid thing, but now it carried something underneath it like a blade wrapped in ice. "I didn't," Nora whispered. "There were too many of them. I just grabbed her hand and I ran. I ran up the stairs and I ran out the door and I ran through the street and the blood is hers because when I pulled her away from them one of them grabbed her arm and I twisted it to make him let go and she fell and scraped her shoulder and I kept running because I knew if I stopped they would catch us and they would take her back and she would disappear again and this time she would not survive it. She would not survive it a second time." The wind outside hammered against the diner windows like something trying to break through. Nicholas set his coffee cup down on the table. Very slowly. Very carefully. Like he was handling something that could detonate if he moved too fast. "Where is she now?" he asked. "The emergency room at Massachusetts General. They are stitching her up. I told them I was her mother. I told them my name was Nora Voss and she was my daughter and she had an accident at home. They did not ask too many questions. People who work in emergency rooms at 3 in the morning have learned not to ask too many questions." Something cold and dangerous stirred in Nicholas Castellano's chest, something that had been sleeping for 4 years, something that had been buried so deep he thought it was dead. But it was not dead. It was only waiting. He turned to Sergio without turning his head. "Make the call," he said. "Tell them we are coming. Tell them the girl is not to leave that hospital. Tell them there is a man coming who loves her more than he loves his own life, and if she is not sitting in a hospital bed when he arrives, there will be consequences." Sergio moved. Dario moved. The sound of car keys and leather jackets and the soft metallic click of safeties being switched off filled the diner. Nicholas looked at Nora for the first time since she had sat down. "You saved her," he said. "You saved my daughter." And the woman sitting across from him, this woman with $5 in her pocket and blood on her coat and a foreclosure notice waiting at home, did not understand why the most dangerous man in Boston was looking at her like she had just performed a miracle. She did not understand that she had rewritten the entire trajectory of her life in the moment she had grabbed a child's hand and run into the snow. She did not understand that everything was about to change. 3 weeks before the snow fell on Boston, Nora Voss stood in the supply closet of Riverside Elder Care Home with someone else's breakfast in her mouth and her heart breaking in her chest. The scrambled eggs were cold. Mr. Patterson had not touched them, had pushed them to the side of his tray with the same trembling hand that had built 3 houses in his lifetime before Alzheimer's took the blueprints from his mind. Nora had carried his tray back to the kitchen at 11:27 a.m., and when no one was watching, when Denise, her supervisor, was counting pills in the medication room and the other aide was helping Mrs. Chen with her shower, Nora had slipped into the narrow closet between the stacked linens and the industrial cleaning supplies and eaten what he would not eat. The eggs tasted like survival. They tasted like her last meal had been yesterday. They tasted like the $5 in her pocket was supposed to last until Friday and it was only Tuesday. The fluorescent light in the hallway hummed its thin, endless song. Somewhere down the corridor, a resident was calling for a nurse who had died in 1987. Nora knew this because she had worked at Riverside for 3 years, 3 years of 6-hour shifts that became 7, of helping the dying wash themselves, of changing sheets stained with the evidence of bodies betraying their owners, of eating what the residents rejected and calling it lunch. The supply closet door opened. Denise stood in the frame, her face a careful arrangement of nothing. She was 62 years old, with a name tag that read supervisor and eyes that had seen everything and chosen to forget most of it. Her uniform was starched white. Nora's was stained at the collar with something that might have been someone else's blood. "The eggs," Denise said. Not a question. "Yes," Nora said. Her voice came out small, like a bird with a broken wing. Denise looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached past Nora, pulled out a plastic container of yogurt from the shelf behind her, and pressed it into Nora's hands. The yogurt was from the staff refrigerator. It had an expiration date 3 days away. "Eat this instead," Denise said. "It has more protein." "And Nora." She waited until Nora looked up at her. "You are not invisible here." "Not to me." Denise closed the door. Her footsteps retreated down the hallway. Nora stood alone in the closet with the yogurt in her hands and tears. She did not allow herself to cry, because crying was a luxury for people who could afford to lose water from their bodies. She opened the yogurt and finished it in 6 slow spoonfuls at 11:52 a.m. At 2:22 p.m. that same Tuesday, Nora pushed open the heavy door of Harbor Children's Shelter on Tremont Street, and the weight of her second life settled onto her shoulders like a coat made of stones. The shelter occupied the first 2 floors of a converted brownstone that had once housed lawyers' offices. Now it housed 15 children who had been found, stolen, sold, abandoned, or rescued. Sometimes it was hard to know which category they fit into because the paperwork was complicated and the funding was worse. Emma was 6 years old, with dark curls that fell to her shoulders and eyes that had learned not to trust at an age when most children were learning to tie their shoes. She was sitting in the reading corner when Nora arrived, which meant she had been waiting since the moment she woke up that morning, positioned where she could see the door, ready to run or hide depending on what shape the day took. "Vivi," Emma said. It was what she called Nora, a sound that meant both alive and beloved in the language that children speak when no other words will do. Nora moved across the room like she was floating, which was what happened when you saw a face that needed you more than oxygen. She sat down on the worn carpet beside Emma, and the girl tilted against her side like a plant turning toward the sun. "Hi, Bug," Nora said. "What are we reading today?" Emma held up a picture book about a horse that had lost its way. The horse looked terrified. The horse looked like it was running from something it could not name. Emma pointed at the horse with one small finger. "Like me?" she asked. The question sat between them like a blade. Nora had learned not to tell children that everything would be fine, because children could smell a lie like blood in water. Instead, she said, "Yes. Like you. But you found your way here. That means you are brave." "I found you," Emma said. "You found me." For years ago, on a night that was colder than this one would be, Emma had been found at South Station by a transit worker at 2 a.m., sitting on a bench with no coat and a suitcase that did not open, her name pinned to her jacket on an index card written in handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone's hands but not their heart. Nora had been the one to take her in that night, because Nora was the volunteer who showed up at 3 in the morning and asked no questions and held the children until their shaking stopped. They read together until 4:15 p.m. Emma's head rested on Nora's shoulder. Nora could feel the small heartbeat, steady and trusting, and she made a silent promise to the universe that she would protect this one if protecting her cost Nora everything she had, which was nothing, but she had learned to work with nothing. At 4:17 p.m., Margaret Harrington walked into the shelter. She was 58 years old and moved like money, which is to say she moved like she had never been told no in her life. Her coat was navy cashmere. Her shoes were Italian leather. Her hair was blonde and arranged in a way that suggested it had conversations with a stylist every 6 weeks. Behind her came Douglas Hale. Douglas Hale was 61, with a kind of handsome that had been purchased in increments over decades, the teeth capped, the hair dyed, the face lifted so many times it looked confused about its own geography. He wore a suit the color of charcoal and a gold watch that cost more than Nora's annual salary, which was $0 because she volunteered here and worked at Riverside for minimum wage that had not increased since before Emma was born. He looked at Emma. Emma's body went rigid. She stood up from the carpet and moved behind Nora, one small hand gripping the back of Nora's shirt. "This is the facility," Margaret said to Douglas, her voice smooth as oil. "As you can see, it's quite small. The director mentioned that funding is drying up. These children will need to be relocated very soon. They're quite vulnerable. Quite unmonitored." She smiled. It looked like a knife wrapped in lipstick. "Quite available." Douglas did not answer. He was still looking at Emma. Nora stood up. The movement was not aggressive, but it was complete. Her body moved in front of Emma's body. Something in her face changed into something else, something that was not the grateful, tired woman who ate cold eggs in closets. Something older. Something that had decided that this moment, this one moment right here, was the moment that would be different. "We're leaving," Nora said to Emma. "Right now." "Nora," Margaret said, her voice shaped like a smile and tasting like arsenic. "I didn't realize you were still volunteering here. How desperately devoted. Though I'm not sure how long the shelter will be able to keep someone so unstable on staff. I had coffee with the director last week, and we discussed some concerns. Previous employers, for instance. I mentioned that I had hired someone from your background years ago and found it quite problematic. I hope that won't be an issue." The message was clear. Nora understood it in the part of her brain that understood threat, which was the same part that understood survival. They were watching. They were pushing. They were testing to see how much pressure it would take to break her. Nora took Emma's hand and walked toward the door. "By the way," Margaret called after her, "I assume you know about the foreclosure on your mother's house. 7 days, I believe. $125,000. How devastating. You must feel quite powerless." They did not know how Margaret knew about the house. They did not understand yet that Margaret Harrington had learned Nora's financial situation the way predators learn the weaknesses of prey. They did not know that Margaret and Douglas had been watching the shelter for 6 months, that they had been charting the funding crisis, that they had been planning to expand their operation into this particular corner of Boston in this particular way. They only knew that they had to leave, and they had to leave now. Nora and Emma walked out into the Boston afternoon. The sky was beginning to cloud over. The temperature was dropping. Winter was coming early that year, like a warning no one had heard. That evening, at 9:27 p.m., Nora sat at her card table in her studio apartment in Dorchester with every light in the room concentrated above her in a single lamp so she could see the numbers clearly. The apartment was 380 square feet. The rent was $1,200 a month. This meant that every dollar she earned had a job before she earned it. The refrigerator had 3 things in it: half a gallon of milk, a box of baking soda to absorb the smell, and a single egg. The egg was for tomorrow. On the table in front of her were coins and crumpled bills. 3 quarters. 7 dimes. 12 pennies. 3 single-dollar bills that looked like they had traveled through a war and survived. 1 $5 bill that she had found in the pocket of a coat at Riverside, a coat left behind by a visitor, and she had looked for the owner for 2 weeks and no one claimed it, and after 2 weeks she had decided that keeping it was not stealing but receiving a gift from a universe that had finally taken pity on her. Total amount, $5.47. This needed to last until Friday. It was Tuesday. That meant 3 days, which meant less than $2 a day, which was possible if she went to the food bank on Wednesday and if nothing broke and if her car did not need gas and if no one at Riverside asked her to cover a shift because then she would have to buy coffee and her body could not survive without coffee at 5 a.m. when the residents needed help getting dressed. On the table next to the money was an envelope from a law office in Connecticut. The letter inside was dated 2 weeks ago. It contained numbers that had been underlined twice, which is what lawyers do when they need you to understand that this number means your life is about to change. $125,000. Owing on a house. Due in 7 days. Nora's mother had co-signed the mortgage 30 years ago with Nora's father before he decided that his family was a burden and his mistress was a future. The house had belonged to Nora's mother ever since, a 3-bedroom ranch in a town called Westfield, 3 hours away, where Nora's mother lived on disability payments and the hope that one day her daughter would come home. Nora had co-signed on the refinance 4 years ago because her mother had asked her to and because Nora did not yet understand that the financial system was designed to squeeze people like her until they could not breathe. Now the loan had been called. Now the bank owned her mother's house and her mother's future, and Nora's impossible decision, file bankruptcy and leave her mother homeless at age 72, or find $125,000 in 7 days, which was a number so large it existed only in theory. Next to the envelope was a pair of tiny pink shoes. They were the first shoes Emma had ever worn at the shelter. They were size 4 in toddler sizes, with Velcro straps and pictures of strawberries on the sides, and they had been purchased for $8.99 at a discount store and worn for 3 months before Emma's feet grew, and Nora had kept them anyway, because throwing them away felt like throwing away proof that Emma had once been smaller, more fragile, more brand new. Nora picked up the shoes. She held them to her chest. She whispered words to the universe that no one else could hear. I kept you safe this long. I will not let them take you now. But what she did not know was that the decision she had made 3 weeks ago, to grab Emma's hand and walk away from Douglas Hale and Margaret Harrington, had already set in motion a series of events that would bring the most dangerous man in Boston directly to her doorstep on a night when the snow fell like a judgment and the city went silent and everything that she thought she understood about powerlessness would transform into something she could not yet imagine. The wind outside her apartment began to pick up. It made a sound like something trying to get in. The diner door swung open at exactly 3:22 in the morning, and Nora Voss stumbled through it like a person walking out of a nightmare that had not yet released her. The blood covering her uniform was not hers. The trembling in her hands was not from cold, though the November blizzard outside had teeth. The real terror lived in her chest, in the knowing, in the absolute certainty that everything she had fought to protect for 4 years was now slipping through her fingers like snow melting on warm pavement. Nicholas Castelliano sat in the back booth of Giuseppe's diner, the kind of place where the coffee tasted like it had been brewing since 1987 and the vinyl seats held the memory of 10,000 tired conversations. He was tall, broad-shouldered, 38 years old but carrying the weight of someone much older. His suit was charcoal grey, tailored to perfection, the kind of suit that cost more than Nora's monthly rent had been before she lost the apartment 3 days ago. A thin scar ran from his left eye to his cheekbone, the map of some old violence he had survived or inflicted or both. His hands rested on the table, steady as stone, but his eyes, dark like a winter sky before a storm, were watching the door with an intensity that suggested he was waiting for something or someone, though his men Sergio and Dario could not have told you what. When Nora walked in, soaked and shaking and bleeding from a split lip where one of them had thrown her against a concrete wall, Nicholas stood. Slowly. His movement was deliberate, controlled, the way a predator moves when it has finally spotted the thing it has been hunting. Nora's eyes met his for a single moment, and in that moment, she saw something shift in his face. His jaw clenched. His breathing deepened. "What did you say your name was?" he asked, his voice low and solid like an oath carved into stone. Nora's voice came out in a whisper, barely a sound. I didn't give my name. The girl you were protecting. Tonight. What is her name? Nora's body went rigid. Fear flooded through her like ice water. How do you know about her name? Nicholas repeated, and this time it was not a question. It was a command wrapped in something that sounded almost like prayer. Emma, Nora said, and the word hung in the air between them like a blade suspended in time. Her name is Emma. The room went absolutely silent. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of something enormous arriving. Sergio and Dario exchanged a look neither had seen in 15 years working for Nicholas Castellano, the look of men watching their boss become something other than himself. Nicholas's hand gripped the edge of the table, and for a moment it seemed like the table might splinter under the pressure of his grip. Describe her, Nicholas said quietly. Everything. Every detail. Start from the beginning. Nora sat down across from him because her legs would no longer hold her. Sergio appeared from the kitchen, moving like a ghost, gentle hand setting a cup of coffee in front of her with cream and sugar already mixed in, as if he somehow knew exactly what a terrified woman needed. Dario locked the diner door and flipped the sign to closed. The snow continued to fall outside, piling against the windows like something trying to bury them. Nora began to speak, and as she spoke, her voice steadied. She told him about finding Emma 4 years ago at the bus station, a tiny girl in shoes with strawberry prints on the sides, crying and alone and unable to tell her name to anyone who would listen. She told him about bringing her to Harbor Children's Shelter, about the way Emma would not speak to the other children but would sit beside Nora during the quiet hours and draw pictures of a man she called Papa. She told him about tonight, about the 3 men in dark coats who came through the shelter's back entrance at 1 in the morning, asking specifically for Emma, speaking into phones about confirmation and hail and taking the girl. I ran, Nora said, her voice steady now, shaped by the desperation of someone who has already survived the worst and lived to speak of it. I grabbed her hand and we went through the kitchen, out the side exit. I told her to run toward the church, to hide in the bell tower where I taught her to hide when the sirens come. One of them caught me before I could follow. Slammed me into the brick wall. He had a knife. He tried, but I fought. I got away. I got here because this was the only place open and I needed to call the police and I needed to. You got away from Douglas Hale's men, Nicholas said, and his voice had transformed into something darker, something that made the fluorescent lights overhead seem dimmer. You are here. You are alive. Emma is alive. He pulled out his phone with fingers that shook just slightly, an almost imperceptible tremor that only someone watching him very carefully would have noticed. He scrolled through his photos and turned the phone toward Nora. The image showed a small girl with dark curls, maybe 2 years old, sitting in the arms of a man with Nicholas's eyes and the same scar running from eye to cheekbone. The girl was laughing. The man was looking at her like she contained the entire universe. Nora's breath caught. That's her. That's Emma. But she's older now, she's 6, and her hair is longer, but yes, that's her. How do you? She's my daughter, Nicholas said, and his voice broke on the final word like ice cracking under too much weight. She was taken 4 years ago from my sister's house in Beacon Hill. One moment I was the uncle watching her sleep, and the next moment she was gone. Disappeared. And for 4 years I have searched, paid investigators, moved heaven and earth to find her, and she was here. She was alive. She was safe. Because of you. Tears moved slowly down his face, and Sergio and Dario looked away not out of disrespect but out of something deeper, the knowledge that they were witnessing something that happened perhaps once in a man's lifetime if he was fortunate and once in a life if he was not. In 15 years of working for Nicholas Castellano, they had never seen him cry. They had seen him hold a man's life in his hands and choose mercy. They had seen him stand over the body of a rival and show nothing on his face. They had never seen him weep. You saved her when you had nothing, Nicholas said, and he leaned forward across the table, his hands open now, palms up, a gesture of vulnerability that seemed impossible from a man whose reputation was built on absolute control. You kept her safe for 4 years. You never even knew she was mine, and still you protected her like she was your own blood. Nora began to cry then too, Quietly, without sound, the way people cry when they have been holding grief for so long that its release becomes almost gentle. I didn't know she was important. I just knew she was a child. I just knew she needed someone. Everyone is important, Nicholas said. But especially her. Especially you, now that I know what you have done. Outside, the wind picked up and made a sound like something trying to get in, like something with intention and hunger pressing against the glass. Nora did not notice. Nicholas did not notice. Sergio made a phone call from the back room, his voice low, giving orders to men who were already moving. Tell me everything, Nicholas said. Not just about tonight. About you. About where you live, how you survive, why you were at the shelter at 1 in the morning covered in blood that is not yours. So Nora told him about the eviction notice, the one that sat on her kitchen counter with red lettering and a date that gave her 72 hours to vacate the apartment she had rented for 3 years. She told him about the foreclosure on her mother's house, the $125,000 that needed to materialize in 7 days or the bank would own everything her mother had spent 40 years building. She told him about the job she lost at the care home, fired by Denise with nothing but apologies and the name of a woman called Margaret Harrington, who had called and said Nora was harassing donors, creating disturbances, the kind of lies that destroy people slowly, from the outside in. I have $5 in my pocket, Nora said, and she pulled out a crumpled bill from her jacket pocket as if showing proof of her own poverty. That is all. $5. I was sleeping at the shelter to save the $40 a night a motel would cost. I thought if I could save $500, maybe I could get a room somewhere cheap, somewhere safe, somewhere I could keep watching Emma. I didn't know the men who took her were coming. I just knew I had to keep her alive. Nicholas listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I will pay the $125,000 today. Consider it done. Consider it erased. Nora's eyes widened. What? No. Absolutely not. I don't even know you. Why would you? Because you saved my daughter when you had nothing, Nicholas said simply. Because you kept her safe when the entire world was trying to take her. Because the people who did this to you, the eviction, the firing, the destruction of your reputation, they did it on purpose. They were trying to break you. They were trying to make you desperate enough to sell yourself. And they almost succeeded, but they did not account for a person like you. Sergio and Dario stared at their boss with an expression that suggested they were witnessing the earth shift on its axis. In 15 years, they had never heard him speak like this, voice soft, words careful, the intensity that usually surrounded him replaced by something that looked almost like tenderness. Margaret Harrington, Nicholas said, turning to Dario. She called the care home. Yes, Dario answered, his fingers already moving across his phone. And the landlord. And 3 other places where Nora had applied for work. Each time she posed as a reference, said Nora was unstable, unreliable, a liability. Find everything, Nicholas said. Bank records. Business partnerships. Property holdings. I want to know who she works with and how deep it goes. What Nora did not know was that 3 blocks away, in a black Mercedes parked on a side street with its engine running, Douglas Hale sat in the driver's seat and spoke quietly into his phone. He was 52 years old, silver-haired, dressed in an expensive suit that had been tailored on Savile Row. His smile never reached his eyes, had not reached his eyes since childhood when he learned that showing feeling was the same as showing weakness. The girl is confirmed to have been at the shelter, he said into the phone. But the maid got away. She ran. The question now is whether she reaches the police before we reach her, or whether we reach her first and make it clear what the price is for running from Douglas Hale. On the other end of the line, Margaret Harrington sat in her office on the 42nd floor of a building in the financial district, overlooking Boston Harbor and all the small lives below that did not matter to her. She was 60 years old, impeccably dressed, with pearl earrings and a Rolex watch and a complete absence of conscience. Then reach her first, Margaret said. Tonight. Before dawn. I don't care what it costs. The girl is worth $2 million on the trafficking market, but she is worth nothing if there are witnesses who can testify to our partnership. Eliminate the maid. Eliminate the problem. She hung up the phone and looked at the framed photograph on her desk, Margaret and Douglas Hale at a charity gala, both smiling, both dressed for the cameras, both of them living in plain sight while they built an empire on stolen lives and broken childhoods. Inside the diner, Nicholas leaned forward and took Nora's hand across the table, his palm warm, his grip steady. "You are not alone anymore," he said. "I need you to understand that. Whatever comes next, you are not alone." The wind outside continued to howl, and the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed through the empty streets like a warning that had come too late. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed like a dying insect at 5:48 in the morning. Outside, the blizzard had turned the world white and merciless, snow accumulating against the windows in drifts that looked like the city was being buried alive. Inside, the black and white checkered floor reflected the harsh overhead glow, and every sound, the hiss of the coffee maker, the tick of the ancient wall clock, Nora's shallow breathing, seemed to echo in the terrible silence. Nicholas sat across from her, his dark overcoat dusted with snow, his expensive suit somehow immaculate even after hours in the frozen night. His hands rested on the laminate table, and they were not trembling. Nora's hands would not stop shaking. The phone on the table between them buzzed. Unknown number. Nicholas reached for it, but Nora's voice stopped him. "It's for me," she whispered. "I know it is. I can feel it." Her fingers found the phone first, and her thumb hit the speaker button. The connection crackled through the diner's silence like a curse taking hold. A man's voice came through, smooth and poisoned, the kind of voice that had practiced cruelty the way other men practiced golf. "Miss Voss. You have something that belongs to me. A little girl. Emma. Such a beautiful name. Such a valuable asset. Douglas Hale." Nora knew the voice from the gas station 3 weeks ago when he had cornered her in the convenience store and whispered what he would pay her if she could bring him children. Her throat closed. Her vision swam. "You have 1 hour," Hale continued, and each word was a blade wrapped in ice. "Bring her to the warehouse at 340 Old Harbor Street. Come alone. Or I will make sure your mother's house isn't the only thing you lose. I have friends at the nursing facility where she lives. The Shady Pines Care Facility on Morrison Avenue. 63 years old, early-stage dementia, on Medicaid because she has nothing else. One word from me and her care becomes inadequate. You understand what I mean by inadequate, Miss Voss?" The phone trembled in Nora's hand. Nicholas reached across the table and took the phone from her, his movement slow, deliberate, like a panther closing in on prey it has been hunting for years. When he spoke, his voice was deep and solid like an oath, and every word carried the weight of his name, his power, his absolute refusal to be threatened. "Hale. This is Nicholas Castellano. You just made the last mistake of your life." The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which the entire balance shifted. Then Hale laughed. A real laugh, genuine and contemptuous, the laugh of a man who thought he was untouchable. "The Mafia prince. I was wondering when you would show up. That child is worth $200,000 to my buyers overseas. You think your name scares me? I have Margaret Harrington's lawyers and political connections protecting me. I have senators on speed dial. You touch me, and you will have federal prosecutors at your door by morning. The whole federal government will descend on your empire, Castellano." "No," Nicholas said quietly. "You won't. Try me." Nicholas hung up the phone and set it face down on the table like a closing argument. He looked at Nora, and in his eyes she saw something dangerous and purposeful crystallize into being. "Emma is safe," he said. "I moved her to a house 2 hours ago. 14 men guarding her. She is more protected than the President of the United States." Nora opened her mouth, but no words came. "What will happen next is not your responsibility. Do you understand? This is no longer your fight." But Nora stood up. She pushed back from the table, and the chair scraped against the floor with a sound like an animal in pain. She walked to the diner's front door, and Nicholas watched her go, not stopping her, understanding without being told that she needed to feel the cold. Outside, the blizzard had intensified. The wind tore through the empty Boston streets like something alive and furious, carrying snow that stung like broken glass against her skin. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees. Nora stood on the sidewalk in her thin uniform, her cardigan offering no protection, and felt the cold seeping into her bones like the cold of abandonment, like the cold of a world that did not care if she lived or died. She was so tired. For years of fighting. For years of taking double shifts, eating other people's leftovers, counting quarters like they were gold coins. For years of watching children in the shelter, trying to save them one by one, knowing that her efforts were like trying to hold back the ocean with her bare hands. For years of losing. Of failing. Of not being enough. Her trembling fingers reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out something worn and small. Emma's first shoes. Pink canvas baby shoes with white laces, size 2, the toes already soft from wear even though Emma had only worn them twice before she came to the shelter. Nora had kept them, had carried them with her like a talisman, like a prayer that never quite got answered. What if she just walked away? What if she disappeared into the snow and let these powerful men fight their war without her? What if she caught a bus and left Boston entirely? She had $5 in her pocket and a foreclosure notice in her bag, and she had nothing else. Nothing. Who was she to fight a human trafficker and a billionaire? Who was she to think she mattered? The snow fell harder. Nora closed her eyes. The wind cut through her like a blade through butter. She thought of walking away, of surrendering, of finally admitting defeat. Then she felt the weight of the shoes in her palm. She remembered Emma's small hand gripping hers in the shelter's hallway. She remembered the child's whispered voice, barely audible, fragile as a candle in the wind. "Miss Nora? Will you stay? Please? Everyone else leaves." Nora's eyes opened. No. She did not get to quit. Emma did not get to lose another person who loved her. She walked back through the diner's door, leaving snow in her wake, and she looked at Nicholas with shoulders squared and spine straight. "Tell me what we do next." Nicholas made one call. Within 2 hours, 12 men in black tactical gear moved like ghosts through Boston's darkness. The warehouse at 340 Old Harbor Street had not been built to last. Its walls were corrugated metal, its roof leaking in 3 places, its foundation gradually surrendering to salt air and neglect. Inside, it held something far more valuable than anything built into its structure. Inside, it held lives. At 8:33 in the morning, the power cut out first. Then the breaches came simultaneously from 3 directions. Doors exploded inward. Windows shattered. Sergeant Sergio and his team moved through the warehouse with military precision, clearing rooms methodically, their weapons drawn but their movements controlled, disciplined. They found 14 women and children. They found filing cabinets full of photographs and names and purchase orders written in meticulous handwriting. Bank transfers. Shipping manifests. Everything documented like a business transaction, because to Douglas Hale, this was business. Douglas Hale was in his office on the 2nd floor, counting money when the door exploded inward. He was 47 years old, expensively dressed in a suit that cost more than a year of Nora's former wages, his hair styled, his nails manicured. He reached for the gun on his desk, but Sergio's boot caught it first, sending the weapon skittering across the floor and out of reach. Hale pressed himself against the back wall, hands up, his confidence suddenly crumbling like wet paper. Nicholas walked in slowly. The snow still dusted his overcoat, melting slightly in the warehouse's ambient temperature. He moved like a man who had spent his entire life learning how to wear power, how to carry it like a weapon that never needed to be drawn. "You threatened a woman under my protection," Nicholas said, his voice absolutely calm, absolutely lethal. "You held my daughter. You thought your connections made you untouchable." Hale dropped to his knees. His mouth was moving, but what came out was not words. It was the sound of a predator recognizing that it had become the prey. "Please," he gasped, trembling like a cornered animal. "I'll give you everything. Money. Names. I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. Please." Nicholas made a phone call and said only 2 words, "He's yours." 10 minutes later, 3 black SUVs arrived at the warehouse's loading dock. Men in tailored suits with the insignia of the Rossetti family stepped out with calculated slowness. The Rossetti underboss, a man named Vittorio who had been waiting for this moment for 3 years, smiled at Hale with the joy of a hunter who has finally found his prey. "We have been waiting for you, Douglas," Vittorio said, his voice like honey poured over razors. "You sold our boss's niece to a buyer in Prague 5 years ago. She did not survive the journey. Now, you are going to discuss what you owe us." Hale screamed as they dragged him toward the SUV. He screamed for mercy. He screamed for mercy from men who understood that mercy was a luxury reserved for people who had earned it. He disappeared into the black SUV and was never seen again. Margaret Harrington sat at her desk on the 42nd floor of the Financial District Tower at 9:15 in the morning, still unaware that her empire had just begun to collapse. She was on a conference call with 3 board members, discussing quarterly projections for the Harrington Foundation, the charity organization that laundered trafficking money through legitimate donations. Her office windows overlooked Boston Harbor, and the view was magnificent, the kind of view you purchased with blood money and political connections. The knock on her door was perfunctory. FBI agents do not wait for invitations. They breached her office with a warrant signed by a federal judge, and Margaret's face drained of color as they read her rights with the precision of people who had conducted this operation 1,000 times. Her pearls suddenly looked like chains. Her Rolex looked like a noose. "Do you know who I am?" she screamed, her voice shattered like glass. "I have senators on speed dial. Governors. This is a mistake. A terrible, catastrophic mistake." "No," the lead agent said, producing zip ties. "It's not." They cuffed her hands behind her back. They led her out of her office and through the hallway, past the shocked faces of her employees, past the portrait of her that hung in the lobby, a Margaret at a charity gala, smiling, pearls gleaming, that carefully constructed image of respectability. Outside, news crews were waiting. Nicholas had made sure of that. Cameras flashed as she was walked toward the federal vehicles, her expensive suit suddenly looking absurd, her hair falling into her face, her carefully constructed reputation dismantling in real time as every news outlet in Boston broadcast her arrest. Douglas Hale had underestimated Nicholas Castellano. Margaret Harrington had as well. Within 1 hour, 500,000 people had seen the footage of her arrest. By morning, 2 million. By the end of the week, every news outlet in the country had run the story. The Harrington Foundation froze its accounts. Federal prosecutors filed charges: conspiracy to commit human trafficking, money laundering, racketeering, organized crime conspiracy. Minimum 40 years. No parole. No possibility of probation. Both villains destroyed. Not by death, death would have been too quick, too easy, too merciful, but by the systematic obliteration of everything they had built. Everything they had believed made them untouchable. Nora stood in the diner as the news reports played on the television bolted to the wall above the counter. She watched Margaret's face as the cuffs went on. She heard the charges being read. She felt something inside her chest unlock for the first time in 4 years, not quite hope, not yet, but the possibility that hope might exist. Nicholas found her there, watching the screen, and he did not speak. He simply placed his hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into the touch like a drowning person reaching for solid ground. The blizzard was finally ending. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the city was emerging from the white darkness into a gray and tentative dawn. Emma was safe. The monsters were gone. And Nora was no longer alone. The safe house in Brookline was quiet except for the sound of a crane moving across paper, the soft scratch of wax on cardboard, the sound of a child's small breathing, the only music that mattered to Nicholas Castellano anymore. Emma sat at a wooden table beside a tall window where afternoon light fell in clean rectangles across her small hands, her dark hair falling into her face the same way his did when he was concentrating, the same way it had fallen before she was stolen, before for years of not knowing if she was alive or dead or somewhere in between. She was 5 years old now. She had been 1 when they took her. The 2 men standing in the corners of the room, Sergio and Dario, both broad-shouldered and stone-faced, both carrying enough firepower to level a city block, watched her with the tenderness of soldiers who had learned that protection meant witnessing small mercies, meant standing guard over ordinary moments that should never have required guarding at all. They heard the car before they heard the footsteps. Tires on gravel. An engine cutting to silence. The soft click of a door closing. Sergio's hand moved to his jacket instinctively, then stopped. He recognized the footsteps on the walk. Nicholas. Emma did not look up from her coloring. She was drawing a house with 3 windows, a door, a sun in the corner, yellow and orange and red bleeding slightly outside the lines the way children's suns always do. The crayon moved with absolute focus, the concentration of a small person who had learned that staying still and staying quiet meant staying safe. The door opened. For a moment, nothing changed. Emma continued her coloring. Her hand moved. The crayon scratched across the paper. The world held its breath without knowing it was holding it. Then she turned. Her eyes lifted from the page to the figure in the doorway, and the crayon fell from her fingers and clattered onto the wooden floor. For 5 full seconds, she did not move. She did not breathe. She simply stared at the man who was a stranger and not a stranger, a face she knew only from dreams, a voice she remembered only as a feeling, the father who had been a ghost for longer than she had been alive. Papa. Her voice was barely a whisper, like a question asked into darkness, like a prayer that did not dare hope for an answer. She ran. Nicholas dropped to his knees in the doorway, his 6'1" frame folding with the grace of a man surrendering to gravity, and she crashed into him like she was flying, like she was falling, like she was coming home to a place she had never forgotten though she could not remember it. His arms closed around her like a cage made of safety, like a fortress built in an instant, like 2 people becoming one whole where before there had only been breaking. They sobbed together, father and daughter, a sound like something ancient being healed, a sound like stone remembering it used to be water, a sound that filled the room and made the air heavy with 4 years of longing compressed into one moment. Emma's small fists gripped his jacket. Her face pressed against his chest where his heartbeat was a drum saying yes, saying here, saying you are real and I am real and we are finally in the same place at the same time. Sergio and Dario turned toward the window. Sergio's jaw clenched. Dario's hand moved to his face. Grown men who had seen violence and death and things that should not be seen in a lifetime, weeping silently at the reunion of a father and a daughter who had been stolen from each other by cruelty and chance. Then Emma pulled back, her small face streaked with tears, her eyes searching his like she was memorizing him all over again, learning him for the first time. You came back, she whispered. I came back, he said, his voice like stone breaking, like thunder turning tender. I will always come back. She turned in his arms toward the doorway where a woman stood, and Emma's eyes cleared suddenly, the cloud of confusion lifting, recognition blooming like a flower opening. She reached one small hand toward Nora and pulled her down into the embrace. Miss Nora saved me, Papa, Emma said simply, stating fact the way only children can, the way that reduces the world to its most essential truth. She always saves me. Even when everyone else left, she stayed. Nicholas looked at Nora over his daughter's head, and his expression transformed into something his men had never witnessed in all their years of serving him, pure gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that looked like love beginning its first breath, like 2 broken people recognizing the shape of healing in each other's presence. His free hand reached toward Nora, and she took it, and the 3 of them sat there in the afternoon light, 3 people who had found each other in the wreckage of other people's cruelty and begun building something that looked like a family. That same afternoon, in Nicholas's study, Nora sat in a leather chair so expensive it probably had a pedigree, her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. The room smelled like old books and expensive cigars and the kind of quiet that only money could purchase. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, filled with volumes that had probably never been read, the aesthetic of intelligence rather than its practice. Nicholas sat across from her, separated by a mahogany desk that cost more than her mother's house would have if she still owned it. Which she didn't. Which was the problem? Which was the reason for this meeting? He did not speak. He simply slid an envelope across the desk toward her. Nora stared at it like it might explode. "Open it," he said. His voice was not a command. It was an invitation. Her hands shook as she picked it up. Inside was a cashier's check made out to the mortgage company holding her mother's house, the foreclosure notice, the debt that had been drowning her for 6 months. $125,000. The exact number from the legal letter that had been haunting her nightmares. Behind the check, keys. 2 of them, attached to a silver key ring engraved with an address in the north end. Below that, a lease agreement, the first year's rent paid in full, furniture included, a 2-bedroom apartment with a view of the harbor. Below that, a letter printed on cream-colored paper with his name at the top. Her hands began to tremble more visibly. "This is too much," she whispered. "Nicholas, I cannot accept all of this." "It is not. It is exactly what is owed," he said, and his voice was calm in a way that made the words heavier. "For years ago, on what I thought was the worst night of my life, when I believed my daughter was gone forever, you saved her. You kept her alive. You kept her safe in ways that I cannot even comprehend. Last night, when you were trapped with nowhere to go and no one to help you, I got to return that debt. To save you. To bring you home." "Home," she repeated, the word breaking apart like old glass. "I have not had a home since." "Then this is the beginning of one," Nicholas said. "I have something else for you." He slid another envelope toward her. Inside was a letter offering her a salary position as Emma's full-time caretaker. $75,000 annually. Full benefits. Housing included. A signature line waiting for her name. Nora read it 3 times. Then a 4th. The numbers would not change. The offer would not disappear. "Emma needs someone," Nicholas continued. "Not a maid. Not a servant. Someone who will stay. Someone she trusts. Someone she loves. That is you." Nora looked up at him, and tears spilled down her face. "You are offering me everything." "No," Nicholas said. "I am offering you something you have never had. A choice. A future. A place where you belong not because you are useful, but because you are wanted." The silence stretched between them, heavy with understanding. That evening, the 3 of them sat at a table in Nicholas's brownstone, Emma between the 2 adults, chattering about her day in the breathless way of children who have just discovered that adults will listen. She held both their hands while eating, switching the grasp back and forth, refusing to sit alone. "Papa, Miss Nora, look what I drawed," Emma said, pulling out the coloring page from earlier, the house with 3 windows and the sun bleeding outside the lines. "I did this all by myself." Nora leaned close, studying it like it was a masterpiece in a museum. "Emma, this is beautiful. This house has 3 windows. Do you see them?" "One for Papa," Emma said, pointing at each window. "One for you. One for me." Nicholas watched Nora's face as she understood what the child was saying, watched the moment that realization struck her like a gentle blade, watched her fight back tears and fail beautifully. Nora wrapped one arm around Emma and held her close, kissing the top of her small head. Nicholas's eyes moved to Nora, held her gaze across the candlelight and the small, impossible miracle of a meal shared by 3 people who had found each other in the dark. Something shifted between them then, silent and irreversible as tectonic plates moving, recognition of shared darkness, shared survival, shared love for this child who was becoming the bridge between 2 broken people learning to heal together. 6 months later, spring had arrived in Boston with the kind of tentative beauty that comes after winter has finally admitted defeat. The garden behind Nicholas's brownstone had exploded into color, cherry blossoms and magnolias, flowering shrubs, the smell of growth and renewal rising from earth that had been frozen solid just weeks before. Nora stood at the edge of the garden, watching Emma saw on a swing set Nicholas had built himself, an act so domestic it had stunned his men to silence. The little girl's laughter cut through the afternoon like music, pure and unburdened, the sound of a child who had learned that the world could be safe because two people had chosen to make it so. Nora wore a sundress, yellow, simple, a color she would never have purchased when she was counting pennies by lamplight. Her mother sat on a bench nearby, her medication paid for, her medical care coordinated by specialists, her guest house on the property surrounded by flowers. Her mother's face was fuller now, less lined with the agony of poverty. She watched her daughter and smiled. Nicholas walked out with 2 cups of coffee, the morning ritual they had built together, casual as breath. Their fingers touched as he handed her the cup. Familiar. Expected. Right. Emma wants to ask you something, he said quietly. Before Nora could respond, Emma jumped from the swing mid-arc, landed in the grass with perfect balance, and ran toward them, her face flushed with excitement and something more vulnerable. Miss Nora, Emma said, her voice suddenly formal in the way of children choosing their most important words carefully. Can I call you Mama? Nora's breath caught. The coffee cup trembled in her hands. Nicholas took it from her gently and set it aside. Nora knelt until she was eye level with Emma, until there was nothing between them but honest distance, until the child could see the truth arriving in a woman's face. Emma, Nora said, her voice barely steady. I would be honored. Emma threw her arms around Nora's neck and held on like she would never let go. Nicholas rested his hand on Nora's shoulder, grounding her in the present moment, in this actual life that had seemed impossible 6 months ago when she was a woman with $5 and a prayer and a foreclosure notice. They stood there, 3 people who had found each other in the dark and chosen to build light instead of running from the shadows, and the world stopped its hurrying long enough to notice something rare, a family being born not from blood but from choice, from survival, from love that had learned to trust again. The pink shoe sat in a shadow box on the mantel now, tiny and worn, the first pair of shoes Emma had worn when Nora found her in the basement shelter all those years ago. A plaque beneath read, "Where it all began." As the sun touched the horizon and the world turned gold, Nicholas stood in the doorway beside Nora, watching Emma chase fireflies across the garden, her mother following with gentle hands ready to catch her if she fell. Family is not always bound by blood, Nicholas said quietly, the words meant only for Nora, but by those who choose to stay when the storm arrives. Nora nodded, unable to speak, tears moving silently down her face, tears that meant something different now, not the salt of despair but the salt of gratitude, of survival, of a future that had been given a shape and a name and a home. If this story moved your heart, if it reached into your chest and reminded you that the worst night of your life might be the beginning of your greatest blessing, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to remember that one moment of courage can change everything. Subscribe to this channel. Tomorrow we have another story that will wreck you in the best way possible. Drop a comment and tell us, what would you have done in Nora's position? We read every single one. Until next time, remember this, you never know when the broken pieces of your life might be gathering themselves to become something whole, something beautiful, something worth surviving for. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye. We will see you again in the next video.